deep in the Appalachian wilderness, where cell towers fear to reach and civilization feels like a distant memory, Jake Matthews swung his axe into rotting cabin beams. The structure was falling apart, but something about this place called to him. Maybe it was the hand-carved initials on the doorframe or the faded wedding photo tucked behind loose wallpaper. Jake wasn't just any handyman. As a former army engineer who'd built bridges in Afghanistan and shelters in disaster zones, he could resurrect anything from rubble, but he'd retreated to these mountains to escape the ghosts of war, seeking peace in solitude and sawdust. Then he pried up the floorboards. Hidden beneath decades of dust lay bundles of love letters, a Purple Heart medal, and a journal that revealed the cabin's true story. A young soldier's promise to return to his bride after World War II, a promise that was never kept. The woman who waited was still alive, 93, and in a nursing home just 50 miles away, believing her husband had abandoned her. Jake had 72 hours before the land was sold to developers. Could he solve a 70-year mystery and heal 2 broken hearts before time ran out? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the valley like a shroud as Jake knelt beside the gaping hole in the cabin floor. His calloused hands trembled slightly as he lifted the first bundle of letters, their edges yellowed and brittle. The ribbon that bound them had once been red, now faded to the color of old roses. He set them carefully on the makeshift table he'd constructed from sawhorses and plywood, his renovation tools forgotten. The Purple Heart caught the filtered sunlight streaming through the broken roof, its purple ribbon still vibrant despite the years. Beside it lay a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked but intact. Jake opened the journal to the first page. The handwriting was precise, the ink slightly faded, property of Thomas Benjamin Hartwell, Private First Class, United States Army. If found, please return to my beloved wife, Catherine Rose Hartwell, Blue Ridge Mountain Cabin, Virginia. The date read September 15, 1945. A chill ran down Jake's spine. He'd seen enough war memorials to recognize the weight of history, but this felt different, personal, sacred. He turned the page and began to read. My dearest Catherine, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me. But know that every breath I take, every step I make, is to come home to you. I've hidden these letters and my medal here, in our special place, because I want you to know that even if I can't make it back, my love for you will remain in these walls forever. Jake's throat tightened. He set the journal down and reached for one of the letters. The envelope was addressed to my beautiful Catherine in the same careful script. Inside, the paper was tissue-thin. October 3rd, 1944, somewhere in France. My darling girl, the sunrise this morning reminded me of your hair catching the light when you laugh. I carry that image with me like a talisman. The war is hard, but knowing you're waiting for me makes me stronger than any armor. I promise you, Catherine, I will come home. We'll finish building our cabin together, just like we planned. Jake read 3 more letters, each one a window into a love so pure it made his chest ache. Thomas wrote about their plans to expand the cabin, to raise children there, to grow old watching sunsets from the porch they'd built together. He wrote about her laugh, her cooking, the way she hummed while hanging laundry. He wrote about coming home, but he never did. Jake picked up the journal again, flipping through pages filled with construction notes, sketches of cabin additions, and more love letters. Near the end, he found what he was looking for, an entry dated March 1946. The doctors say I won't make it much longer. The shrapnel they couldn't remove has shifted. Catherine thinks I'm still missing in action. Maybe it's better this way. She won't have to watch me die by inches in some sterile hospital bed. She's young, beautiful, full of life. She deserves better than a broken soldier who can barely remember his own name some days. I've asked my friend Mickey to tell her I died in France. Clean, heroic. She'll mourn and move on, find someone who can give her the life she deserves. She'll never know I made it back to American soil only to fail her in the end. He pulled out his phone, frustrated by the single bar of service. After several attempts, he managed to connect to the internet long enough to search for Catherine Hartwell. The results made his heart race. Catherine Hartwell, 93, resident of Sunset Manor Nursing Home, just 50 miles down the mountain. Still alive, still waiting for answers she didn't even know existed. Jake gathered the letters and journal carefully. Thomas Hartwell might not have made it home in 1946, but his love story wasn't over yet. The morning sun filtered through gaps in the boarded windows, casting thin golden bars across the dusty floor where Marcus knelt with his crowbar. He'd been working since dawn, methodically prying up the warped planks that had buckled near the stone hearth. The wood groaned in protest, releasing decades of settled dust into the stale air. His original plan had been simple: assess the foundation, check for rot, maybe salvage what he could. But something about this place pulled at him differently than his usual projects. Maybe it was the way the morning light revealed careful craftsmanship in the hand-hewn beams, or how the stone chimney stood perfectly plumb despite years of neglect. Someone had built this cabin with love, not just necessity. The floorboard came up with a sharp crack, and Marcus paused to wipe sweat from his forehead. Beneath the removed planks, the subfloor looked solid enough, though he'd need to check the joists more thoroughly. He reached for the next board when something caught his eye: a deliberate gap between two floor joists, too uniform to be accidental. Marcus angled his flashlight into the space and froze. Wrapped in what appeared to be oiled canvas, a small bundle sat nestled between the wooden supports. His pulse quickened as he carefully extracted the package, noting how the cloth had protected its contents from moisture and decay. Inside the canvas, his calloused fingers found a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth but intact. Beneath it lay a small wooden box, expertly crafted with dovetail joints that spoke of a skilled hand. The journal's first page bore an inscription in careful script: "For Eleanor, my heart in written form. All my love, Thomas." June 1943. Marcus settled back against the stone hearth and opened to the first entry, dated 3 days after the inscription. "My dearest Eleanor has agreed to marry me. I write this in our cabin, yes, ours now, where I built every room with dreams of our life together. The war feels distant here, though I know it cannot remain so forever. But tonight, with her sleeping beside me and the fire crackling low, I believe in forever." The entries continued through that summer, painting vivid pictures of a young couple carving out happiness in the wilderness. Thomas wrote of teaching Eleanor to fish in the nearby stream, of her laughter echoing through the trees when she caught her first trout. He described building her a garden plot behind the cabin, how she'd planted wildflowers among the vegetables because beauty feeds the soul as much as sustenance feeds the body. Marcus found himself smiling at Thomas's obvious adoration, the way he captured Eleanor's quirks and kindnesses in loving detail. She collected smooth stones from the creek bed. She hummed while cooking breakfast. She had a habit of standing in the doorway at sunset, one hand resting on the frame he'd carved with their initials. But as autumn approached, the tone shifted. References to the war crept in more frequently. Thomas mentioned friends who'd enlisted, the pressure he felt to serve, Eleanor's growing worry each time he rode to town for supplies and news. The entry dated October 15th hit Marcus like a physical blow. "I've enlisted. The decision tears at my heart. But how can I build a future in a world I'm not willing to fight for? Eleanor hasn't spoken to me since I told her. She sits by the window, staring at the mountains, as if she could will them to hide us from the world forever. I leave at dawn. God help me. I don't know how to say goodbye to her." Marcus's chest tightened as he read the final entry, written in what must have been candlelight, the handwriting less steady. "If something happens to me, I pray Eleanor finds happiness again. I've hidden this journal and my grandmother's ring in our special place. Eleanor knows where. If she reads this someday, I want her to know that every moment with her was worth a lifetime. Our love is the truest thing I've ever known. Build a good life, my darling. Love again. I'll be waiting." The wooden box contained the ring Thomas had mentioned, a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the light like captured starfire. Beneath it lay a photograph of a young woman with kind eyes and an easy smile, standing in the very doorway where Marcus now sat. Eleanor. Marcus closed the journal with reverent care, his mind racing. Had Thomas survived the war? Had he ever returned to this cabin, to Eleanor? The questions multiplied as he considered the decades of abandonment, the way the cabin felt frozen in time rather than simply forgotten. He thought of his own solitary life, the way he'd chosen isolation after his divorce, convincing himself that independence meant strength. But Thomas's words painted love as its own kind of courage, the willingness to build something beautiful despite an uncertain world. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the first drops of rain began pattering against the roof. Marcus carefully rewrapped the journal and ring, his renovation plans suddenly taking on new urgency. This wasn't just about restoring a building anymore. Somewhere out there, Eleanor might still be alive, might still be wondering what happened to the man who'd loved her enough to carve their initials into a doorframe. The morning light filtered through the cabin's grimy windows as Jake measured the warped floorboards in what must have been the main living area. 3 days of steady work had already transformed the exterior. New shingles on the roof, reinforced foundation stones, and fresh chinking between the logs. But it was the interior that held the real challenges, and apparently the real surprises. His crowbar caught on something as he pried up the 4th plank near the stone fireplace. Not a nail or a splinter, but something that crinkled like paper. Jake set down his tools and worked his fingers into the gap, feeling around until he grasped what felt like an envelope. The paper was yellowed and brittle, protected by its hiding place, but still fragile with age. In faded blue ink, someone had written for Margaret across the front in careful script. Jake turned it over, noting the wax seal that had been broken long ago. He shouldn't read it. Every instinct told him this was private, sacred even. But the cabin had been abandoned for decades, and if there was family correspondence hidden here, maybe it contained clues about the property's history, information the real estate agent had glossed over with vague mentions of estate settlement and no living heirs. Jake carefully unfolded the letter. The paper nearly tore along the creases, but the words were still legible. "My dearest Margaret, by the time you read this, I'll be on the transport to England. I know we planned to marry before my deployment, but the orders came through faster than expected. I'm leaving this for you because I couldn't bear to see the look in your eyes when I said goodbye. The cabin is ours now. I bought it from old Henderson with the money I'd been saving for your ring. I know it's not much, but it's a start. When I come back, we'll fix it up proper. We'll have our wedding there, and our children will grow up running through those woods. I've hidden something else for you beneath the hearthstone. Think of it as a promise that no matter what happens over there, no matter how long this war drags on, I'm coming back to you. Wait for me. On all my love, Thomas." Jake read the letter twice, then carefully set it aside. Thomas and Margaret. The names felt familiar now, like he'd been expecting to learn them. His eyes moved to the massive stone hearth dominating the cabin's far wall. The hearthstone was a slab of granite nearly 3 feet square. Jake ran his hands along its edges, looking for any sign it had been disturbed. On the left side, he found what he was looking for. The mortar was different, newer, as if someone had removed and replaced the stone. It took an hour and his heaviest pry bar to work the stone loose. Underneath, wrapped in oiled cloth, sat a small wooden box. Inside the box, a diamond ring, modest but clearly chosen with care, and another letter. This one was addressed simply to my wife in the same careful handwriting. Jake's hands hesitated over the second letter. Reading the first had felt like trespassing, but at least it had been opened before. This one's seal was intact. Before he could second-guess himself, he broke the wax. "The Margaret. You're reading this? Then the worst has happened. The ring was meant for our wedding day, but I want you to have it now. Wear it and know that somewhere across an ocean, a man loves you more than his own life. Don't wait for me forever. You deserve happiness, children, a full life. But know that every sunrise I see, every sunset that ends another day of this hell, I'm thinking of our cabin and the life we dreamed of building there. The property deed is in the box too. The cabin is yours, whatever happens to me. Maybe someday you'll bring your children there and tell them about the soldier who loved their mother enough to buy her a castle in the woods. Thomas. At the bottom of the box, Jake found the deed, made out to Margaret Rose Sullivan, 1943, and a small photograph. A young woman with dark hair and bright eyes stood next to a man in uniform. Both were smiling, his arm around her waist, her hand resting on his chest. On the back, someone had written T&M, June 1943. Jake sat back on his heels, studying the photograph. These weren't just names in old letters anymore. They were real people who had loved each other, who had planned a future in this very room where he now knelt surrounded by sawdust and renovation plans. But if Margaret had inherited the cabin in 1943, what had happened to her? Why was the property abandoned, eventually sold for back taxes? Had she ever gotten Thomas's letters, or had they remained hidden under the floorboards all these years? More importantly, had Thomas made it home from the war? Jake gathered the letters, the ring, and the photograph carefully. His renovation project had just become something entirely different. Somewhere out there might be family members who deserved to know this story. Children or grandchildren who had no idea their heritage included a love story hidden in the mountains. He had to find Margaret Rose Sullivan. He pried up another board, revealing a small cavity beneath. His fingers found something wrapped in oilcloth, preserved against time and moisture. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, each envelope bearing the same careful handwriting he'd seen before. The return address made his breath catch. E. Morrison, somewhere in France, 1944. Jake settled back against the wall and opened the first letter with trembling hands. The paper was delicate, yellowed at the edges, but the ink remained clear enough to read. Dearest Margaret, the fighting grows fierce here, but thoughts of you and our little cabin keep me warm on the coldest nights. I dream of the day we'll sit by the fire together, planning our future. Tell me everything. How the garden grows, what birds nest in the eaves, how you spend your evenings. Your words are my lifeline. The intimacy of the words made Jake feel like an intruder, yet he couldn't stop reading. Letter after letter revealed a love story that transcended the brutality of war. Edwin wrote of mud-filled trenches and the kindness of fellow soldiers, while Margaret's responses, which Jake found in a separate bundle, painted pictures of a woman holding their world together with fierce determination. Eddie, I've news that will change everything. Our love has created something beautiful. By the time this reaches you, I'll be showing. I pray this war ends soon so you can meet our child. Jake's chest tightened. The joy in Margaret's words was palpable, her excitement leaping from the page despite the uncertainty of wartime. He searched frantically through the remaining letters, looking for Edwin's response. When he found it, dated 3 months later, his heart sank. My darling Margaret, your letter about the baby fills me with such joy I can barely contain it. I've told everyone here, they're all eager to meet the little one when we return. But I must tell you something that tears at my soul. We're being shipped to the Pacific. They say it could be years before I see home again. Take care of yourself and our child. I'll find my way back to you both, I swear it. The next letter was different. Not in Edwin's handwriting, but from someone named Lieutenant James Parker. Jake's hand shook as he read the formal condolences, the regretful notification that Private Edwin Morrison had been killed in action on a beach in the Philippines. The letter was addressed to Margaret, but stamped return to sender, addressee unknown. Jake stared at the returned letter, understanding flooding through him. Margaret had never received word of Edwin's death. She would have waited, hoped, wondered why his letters stopped coming. And their child, what had happened to their child? He dug deeper into the hiding place, finding Margaret's final letters to Edwin, written months after his death but never sent. In them, she poured out her heart about their daughter, a little girl she'd named Elena after Edwin's grandmother. The last letter, dated December 1945, was barely coherent through her tears. "Eddie, I can't wait anymore. They're making me give up Elena for adoption. I have no money, no family willing to help. I thought you were coming home. I thought we'd raise her together in our cabin. I'll hide these letters where we carved our names, hoping somehow you'll find them and understand. I love you both more than life itself." Jake's vision blurred as he read her final words. The tragedy of it overwhelmed him. A love story destroyed by war and miscommunication, a family torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. Edwin had died believing his wife and child were safe at home, while Margaret had given up their daughter thinking she'd been abandoned. But Elena, their daughter, might still be alive. If she'd been born in 1944, she'd be nearly 80 now. Perhaps she had children, grandchildren, a family that had no idea about the love story that created their lineage. Jake gathered the letters carefully, his renovation project suddenly seeming insignificant compared to this discovery. These weren't just historical artifacts, they were pieces of broken lives that maybe, somehow, could still be mended. He thought about the adoption Margaret mentioned, the agencies that might have records. In 1945, documentation would have been kept, archived somewhere. With today's technology, genealogy websites and databases, finding Elena Morrison might actually be possible. The cabin felt different now, charged with purpose beyond mere restoration. Jake looked around the room with new eyes, seeing not just a renovation project but a memorial to love interrupted. Every board he replaced, every window he repaired, would be an act of honoring Edwin and Margaret's dream. He carefully rewrapped the letters and placed them in his backpack. His first stop would be the local historical society, then the library. If Elena was out there, if she had family wondering about their roots, he was going to find them. Some mysteries, Jake realized, were meant to be solved. The leather journal felt warm in Jake's calloused hands as he settled onto the porch steps, the morning sun casting long shadows through the pine trees. He'd barely slept, his mind churning over the discovery beneath the floorboards. Now, with coffee steaming beside him and the forest quiet except for distant birdsong, he opened to the first page. April 15th, 1943. See, my dearest Thomas, the cherry blossoms bloomed early this year, as if they know you won't be here to see them at their peak. I pressed one between these pages. Our first spring memory preserved, like I'm trying to preserve all of you before you leave for the Pacific. Jake's chest tightened. The faded pink petals were still there, papery and fragile, clinging to the yellowed page. He turned carefully, finding entry after entry in the same elegant script. The entries painted a picture of a woman desperately in love, counting days and rationing hope like the sugar and coffee the war had made precious. Her name was Elena. He learned that from an entry where she'd practiced signing Elena Morrison in careful loops, dreaming of their wedding day. June 12th, 1943. Her letters come sporadically now. The sensors have blacked out so much that I'm reading more ink than words, but I can still feel you between the lines, in the way you always end with "forever yours," even when you can't tell me where you are or what you've seen. Jake found himself leaning forward, drawn into Elena's world of uncertainty and longing. She wrote about tending her garden, about the baby deer that visited each morning, about the way sunset painted the mountains purple, but underneath every mundane detail was the constant ache of missing Thomas. September 3rd, 1943. Essent, I have news that will make your heart sing. I'm carrying our child. Our last night together before you shipped out has given us the most precious gift. I can hardly believe it myself. Mrs. Henderson confirmed it yesterday. By spring, there will be 3 hearts beating in this cabin instead of just mine, waiting for you. November 28th, 1943. It's been 6 weeks since your last letter. I know the Pacific fighting has intensified. The radio speaks of islands with names I can't pronounce, of battles that rage for days. I press my hands to my growing belly and tell our little ones stories about their brave father, about how you carved me a ring from pine bark on our first anniversary because the war had taken all our savings. Jake's throat constricted. He could picture Elena, alone in the cabin as winter approached, talking to her unborn child about a father who might never come home. The isolation, the uncertainty, it was a different kind of survival than anything he'd ever faced. December 24th, 1943. And Christmas Eve without you feels like sacrilege. I made cookies from my hoarded sugar ration and hung the stockings you whittled for us. 3 now, including the tiny one I knitted for the baby. If you were here, you'd be reading me Dickens by the fire while I worked on the baby blanket. Instead, I read aloud to our child, hoping somehow they can hear the love in both our voices. January 15th, 1944. The baby moves constantly now, as if restless with waiting just like their mother. I've convinced myself it's a boy. He has your stubbornness already, kicking me awake at dawn. I talk to him about you constantly, about your gentle hands and quick smile, about the way you can track anything through these woods and make fire from nothing. He'll need to know these things about his father. The journal trembled in Jake's hands. Something in Elena's tone had shifted, a fragile hope battling growing dread. He'd found personal effects spanning several decades in that hiding place, but these entries were clearly from the war years. What had happened to Elena and Thomas? To their child? As if summoned by his thoughts, a truck engine rumbled up the access road. Jake looked up to see a Forest Service vehicle approaching, dust swirling behind it. He quickly closed the journal, uncertain why he felt protective of Elena's words, but knowing instinctively that her story deserved careful handling. The truck door slammed and footsteps approached the cabin. Jake's renovation project had just become infinitely more complicated. The storm that had been threatening all morning finally broke as Jake spread the letters across the cabin's main table. Rain drummed against the windows he'd repaired just days earlier, creating a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the urgency building in his chest. Each piece of correspondence told a fragment of a story that grew more compelling with every page. Margaret's handwriting evolved throughout the years, from the careful script of a young woman to the hurried scrawl of someone desperate to maintain connection across an ocean. The earliest letters, dated 1943, spoke of wedding plans postponed and promises to wait. Thomas had been deployed to the Pacific, leaving behind not just his fiancée, but dreams of building their life together in this very cabin. "My dearest Thomas," one letter began, "Father says the foundation you poured before leaving is already cracking from the frost. I've hired Mr. Henderson to repair it, though he warns the whole project might need to wait until after the war. How strange that our home waits for you just as I do." Jake glanced toward the foundation he'd been reinforcing, understanding now why certain sections had seemed newer than others. Every beam he'd straightened, every board he'd replaced, was part of a love story interrupted by world events beyond two people's control. The letters from Thomas painted a picture of a man clinging to hope amid unimaginable circumstances. His descriptions of Pacific islands were sparse, censored by military protocol, but his longing for home came through in every line. "I dream about sitting on our porch, watching the sunrise over the lake with you beside me. Some nights, it's the only thing that keeps me going." As the storm intensified outside, Jake found himself drawn deeper into their correspondence. Margaret's letters revealed a woman struggling to maintain normalcy while her world shifted around her. She'd taken a job at the munitions factory, moved back in with her parents to save money, and spent weekends at the cabin site, sometimes just sitting on the completed foundation, writing to Thomas about their future. Then came the letter that changed everything. Dated November 1944, Margaret's handwriting was barely legible, as if written through tears. "Thomas, I don't know how to tell you this, so I'll just write the words plain. I'm pregnant. Before you left, that last night, I know we said we'd wait until we were married, but I can't regret it now. This baby is all I have of you, and I love him already." Jake's hands stilled on the paper. The timeline was becoming clearer, and with it, a growing sense of tragedy he couldn't yet fully grasp. Margaret's subsequent letters described her family's reaction, the shame they felt she'd brought upon them, and their ultimatum: give up the baby for adoption or find somewhere else to live. She'd chosen the cabin, even in its unfinished state, winterizing it as best she could with help from sympathetic neighbors. "I'm living in our home now," she wrote in December 1944. "It's cold and the roof leaks when the wind blows from the north, but it's ours. Our baby will be born here, in the place where we plan to grow old together. I've hidden your letters under the floorboards, along with my own copies. Somehow it makes me feel like you're here with me." Jake looked down at the loose floorboard where he'd found the letters, understanding now why it had been deliberately weakened. Margaret had created a time capsule, a repository for their love story. The next few letters were brief, describing the challenges of surviving a harsh winter alone while pregnant. Margaret had relied on the kindness of distant neighbors and her own determination to protect the life growing inside her. She wrote about talking to the baby, telling him about his father's strength and courage, preparing him for a world where his daddy might not return. Then, abruptly, the letters stopped. Jake searched through the remaining papers, finding Thomas's continued correspondence growing increasingly frantic. His letters from early 1945 spoke of not hearing from Margaret in months, of his desperate attempts to get word to her through mutual friends. The war was winding down, and he was planning his return, making arrangements to finish the cabin and finally marry the woman who'd waited for him. His final letter, dated August 1945, was brief and devastating. "Margaret, I'm coming home. The war is over, and I'm coming home to you, to us. Wait for me." But she hadn't been there to receive it. The letter remained unopened, hidden beneath the floorboards with all the others. Jake sat back in his chair, the weight of the unfinished story pressing down on him. What had happened to Margaret? To the baby? Had Thomas ever found them? Or had he returned to an empty cabin and unanswered questions? Outside, the storm was beginning to pass, but inside the cabin, Jake felt as though he was standing at the edge of a much larger tempest. These weren't just letters anymore. They were clues to a mystery that had been waiting 75 years for someone to solve it. He reached for his laptop, knowing his renovation project had just become something far more important. The morning fog clung to the valley like a shroud as Jack emerged from the cabin, Elena's worn photograph tucked carefully in his shirt pocket. The weight of her story pressed against his chest with each breath, a constant reminder of the promise he'd made to a stranger who felt less like a stranger with every passing hour. Elena had left before dawn, her rental car's taillights disappearing down the mountain road like dying embers. She'd pressed a slip of paper into his hand, an address in Prague, written in her grandmother's spidery handwriting. "If you find anything else," she'd whispered, her voice thick with hope and fear in equal measure. Jack stood on the porch, surveying the cabin with new eyes. What had seemed like a simple renovation project now felt like an archaeological dig, each board potentially hiding another piece of Magda and Franz's story. The floorboards he'd already pulled up lay stacked against the exterior wall, and he found himself studying them as if they might reveal secrets he'd missed. The October air bit at his face as he hefted his crowbar and headed back inside. The section of floor near the stone fireplace remained untouched, its planks darker and more weathered than the rest. Something about the way the wood grain curved there had always struck him as odd, but he'd attributed it to age and settling. Now he wondered if there was more to it. The first board came up easier than expected, the nails having worked loose over decades of temperature changes. Underneath, the support beam showed fresh scratches, recent enough to catch the morning light filtering through the windows. Someone had been here before him, and recently. Jack's pulse quickened as he pried up the adjacent boards. A rectangular depression in the earth below revealed itself, about the size of a shoebox. Empty now, but the outline in the dirt was clear. Whatever had been hidden here was gone. "Damn," he muttered, sitting back on his heels. The violation felt personal, as if someone had stolen from Elena directly. But who else knew about the cabin's secrets? Elena had seemed genuinely surprised by the existence of the love letters. A glint caught his eye from deeper under the floorboards. Jack grabbed his flashlight and crawled forward, sweeping the beam across the foundation stones. There, wedged between two rocks, a small metal object reflected the light back at him. He worked it free with the tip of his knife, a brass key, green with patina but still solid. Unlike the delicate skeleton key that had unlocked Magda's memory box, this one was modern, probably from the 1940s. A small tag hung from it, the leather cracked but legible. Station 47. Jack turned the key over in his palm. Station 47 could be anything: a train station, a military post, a storage facility. Without more context, it was just another puzzle piece without a picture to guide him. The sound of an approaching vehicle made him pocket the key and move to the window. A Forest Service truck wound up the narrow road, its green paint dulled by years of mountain weather. Jack recognized the driver, Tom Martinez, a ranger he'd met during the permitting process for the renovation. "Morning, Jack," Tom called out as he climbed from the truck. "Thought I'd check on your progress. Some folks reported seeing lights up here at odd hours." "Just me working late," Jack replied, though something in Tom's tone made him cautious. "Coffee? I've got a pot going." Tom nodded and followed him inside, his eyes immediately drawn to the torn-up flooring. "Quite a project you've got here. Finding anything interesting under those old boards?" The question was casual, but Jack caught the way Tom's gaze lingered on the exposed foundation. The usual: mice nests, old newspapers, nothing worth writing home about. Tom accepted the coffee mug but didn't drink. "You know, this cabin has quite a history. Built in the 30s by some European immigrants. Story goes they hid valuable things here during the war years." Jack kept his expression neutral. "Valuable things?" "Documents, mostly. Things that might have been dangerous to keep in the city." Tom's eyes met Jack's over the rim of his untouched coffee. "Course, that's just local folklore, probably nothing to it." The conversation felt like a chess match, each man probing for information the other might possess. Jack thought about the empty hiding spot under the floorboards, the fresh scratches on the support beam. Had Tom been here before? "Well," Tom said finally, setting down his full mug, "I should let you get back to work. Just remember, if you do find anything unusual, there are proper channels for handling historical artifacts. Wouldn't want anything important to get lost." After the ranger left, Jack stood in the doorway watching the truck disappear around the bend. The warning had been politely delivered but unmistakable. Someone else was interested in the cabin's secrets, and they were watching. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to Elena's number. She answered on the second ring. "I think we have a problem," he said. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin's weathered porch as Jake spread the photographs and letters on the makeshift table he'd constructed from salvaged planks. 3 days had passed since his discovery beneath the floorboards, and each artifact seemed to whisper fragments of a story that grew more compelling with every piece he uncovered. Sarah Chen arrived precisely at 8, her hiking boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. She carried a thermos of coffee and a leather satchel that Jake suspected contained research materials. Her efficiency impressed him, though he wouldn't admit it aloud. "Any luck with your grandmother's journals?" he asked, accepting the steaming cup she offered. "More than I expected." Sarah settled beside him, her shoulder brushing his as she opened her satchel. "My grandmother kept meticulous records. Look at this." She withdrew a faded composition notebook, its pages yellowed with age. Her fingers traced the careful handwriting as she translated passages from Chinese to English. She mentions Elena Volkov several times. They met at the camp medical station where my grandmother worked as a translator. Jake leaned closer, catching the subtle scent of jasmine in Sarah's hair. "What does she say about her?" Elena was pregnant when she arrived at the camp. Alone, frightened, speaking broken English. Sarah's voice softened as she read. "My grandmother helped deliver her baby in the winter of 1953, a boy named Michael." The name hit Jake like a physical blow. He rifled through the photographs until he found the one he'd been studying obsessively, a young woman holding an infant, her face radiant despite the harsh conditions visible in the background. This has to be them. Sarah studied the photograph, then cross-referenced it with her grandmother's notes. Elena told my grandmother she was waiting for someone, a man named David who'd promised to find them after the war. She believed he was alive, searching for her. But he never came? Not while she was at the camp. Sarah turned several pages. Elena and Michael left in the spring of 1954. My grandmother writes that a Red Cross worker helped arrange their relocation, but she doesn't specify where. Jake felt the familiar frustration that had plagued him since childhood, the sense of pieces floating just beyond his grasp. He'd built his adult life around self-sufficiency, partly because depending on incomplete information had always felt dangerous. Yet here he was, drawn into a mystery that demanded he trust fragments and hope. "There's something else," Sarah continued, her voice hesitant. "My grandmother mentions Elena's last name wasn't originally Volkov. It was something she took to hide her identity during the war." "Hide from what?" "She doesn't specify, but Elena spoke German fluently. My grandmother suspected she'd fled the Soviet zone. Can you make out this signature?" He pointed to faded ink at the bottom of what appeared to be a response letter. Sarah squinted at the careful script. "It looks like 'Your devoted Elena,' but there's something else written below it, almost too faint to read." She tilted the paper toward the light. "It might be until the mountains crumble." The phrase resonated with something Jake couldn't quite place. He'd heard those words before, or something similar. What kind of promise is that? An eternal one. Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. In Chinese culture, mountains represent permanence, unchanging love. Maybe Elena was adapting that concept. Jake's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it absently, then froze. The message was from his contractor friend Pete, whom he'd asked to research property records for the cabin. "Found something interesting about your cabin. Previous owner died in 2019, Michael Volkov, age 65. Bought the property in 1987. No heirs listed, but there's a forwarding address for personal effects. You might want to see this." Sarah noticed his expression change. "What is it?" Jake showed her the message, watching her eyes widen as she processed the implications. Michael Volkov, Elena's son. He owned this cabin. The letters, the photographs. He put them there. He knew this story intimately. Jake felt pieces clicking into place, though the larger picture remained frustratingly incomplete. He was preserving evidence, maybe hoping someone would eventually piece it together. Sarah was already pulling out her phone. "We need to find that forwarding address. If Michael saved personal effects somewhere, there might be more information about Elena and David." Jake nodded, but his mind was racing beyond the immediate next steps. Michael had chosen this specific location for the cache, hidden it carefully but not impossibly, almost as if he'd intended for it to be discovered by someone willing to invest time and care in the search. Someone exactly like Jake, who understood the value of things others might overlook. The realization sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The sound of tires on gravel pulled Jake from his restless sleep. He'd spent the night on the cabin's newly reinforced porch, unable to bring himself to sleep inside after discovering the photographs. Through the pre-dawn mist, he watched a rental car navigate the winding dirt road that led to his sanctuary. Margaret stepped out first, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose bones remembered every winter they'd endured. Behind her emerged a woman in her 50s, with Margaret's same determined jaw and eyes that held decades of unanswered questions. The family resemblance was unmistakable. "You must be Jake," Margaret said, her voice steadier than it had been on the phone. "This is my daughter, Sarah." Sarah's gaze swept over the cabin with an intensity that made Jake uncomfortable. She was cataloguing every detail, searching for pieces of a story that had shaped her entire life without her knowing it. "Thank you for calling," Sarah said simply. It's been difficult since she started remembering." Margaret moved toward the cabin, as if drawn by invisible threads. Her weathered hand traced the doorframe where Jake had found the initials carved deep in the wood. "Thomas did that," she whispered. "Said he wanted something permanent, something that would last longer than the war." Jake led them inside, watching Margaret's face transform as memories collided with reality. The space looked different now. His renovations had stripped away decades of neglect, revealing the bones of what had once been a home filled with desperate love. "The letters," Margaret said suddenly. "You said you found letters." Jake retrieved the metal box, his hands surprisingly steady as he placed it on the table he'd crafted from salvaged floorboards. Margaret's fingers trembled as she lifted the lid, and the scent of old paper and faded ink filled the room like ghosts exhaling. She pulled out the first letter, and Jake watched 70 years collapse in an instant. Her eyes moved across words she'd written in another lifetime, when the world was on fire and love felt both infinite and impossibly fragile. "I thought they were lost," she breathed. "When I came back after the war, everything was gone. The cabin was abandoned, boarded up. I assumed—" "You came back?" Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. "Mother, you never told me any of this." Margaret's laugh was hollow, filled with the weight of choices that had rippled across generations. "What was I supposed to say? That I loved someone before your father? That I spent 3 months in this cabin living a life I could never have again?" Sarah sank into the chair Jake had positioned by the window, the same window where Thomas had once watched for Margaret's return from town. "Tell me now," she said quietly. "Tell me everything." For the next 2 hours, Margaret's voice filled the cabin with stories that seemed to resurrect the very walls. She spoke of Thomas, brilliant, gentle Thomas, who'd been recovering from wounds that went deeper than flesh. She described nights when they'd planned a future that felt as real as the fire crackling in the hearth, and days when the war felt like something happening on another planet. "He was supposed to meet me in San Francisco," Margaret continued, her voice growing distant. "After his discharge, we'd planned everything, a small apartment near the harbor, maybe a bookshop. He loved books." "What happened?" Jake asked, though he dreaded the answer. Margaret's silence stretched long enough for the weight of history to settle between them. "His unit was called back for one final mission, something classified. They wouldn't tell me details. He promised he'd write, promised he'd make it to California." She picked up another letter, one Jake hadn't read. "This was the last one I received." Sarah leaned forward as Margaret read aloud words written in Thomas's careful script. "My darling Margaret, if something happens to me, know that our time at the cabin was the most real thing I've ever experienced. I've hidden something for you there, something I pray you'll find someday. Look where we carved our promise into the heart of the place we called home." The three of them turned toward the alcove simultaneously. Jake's renovations had exposed the carved initials, but he hadn't thought to look deeper. With Margaret and Sarah watching, he worked his fingers around the edges of the board, feeling for the loose section Thomas had described. Behind the panel, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow survived 7 decades, was a small wooden box. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay an engagement ring and a folded paper that would change everything they thought they knew about Thomas's fate. The rain drummed against the cabin's new roof as Jake spread the yellow documents across the kitchen table, his hands trembling slightly as he arranged them in chronological order. Each letter, each photograph, each carefully preserved memento told a piece of the story that had consumed his thoughts for weeks. The kerosene lamp cast dancing shadows across Margaret's handwriting, making her words seem to move and breathe in the flickering light. He picked up the first letter again, dated September 1943, addressed to Thomas Hartwell. Margaret's voice seemed to whisper from the page as he read about her pregnancy, her fear, her unwavering love despite the impossible circumstances. The paper felt fragile between his fingers, as if it might crumble at any moment, taking with it the last evidence of their desperate romance. Outside, the storm intensified, wind howling through the pines with a loneliness that matched Jake's growing obsession. He'd been living in the cabin for 3 months now, telling himself he was still renovating, but the truth was more complicated. Every board he'd replaced, every wall he'd restored, had revealed another clue, another piece of the puzzle that was Margaret and Thomas's interrupted life. The floorboard discovery had been just the beginning. Behind a loose stone in the fireplace, he'd found more letters. Tucked beneath a windowsill, a small jewelry box containing a simple gold ring and a baby's tooth. Each discovery felt like an invasion of privacy, yet he couldn't stop searching, couldn't abandon the story that had no ending. Jake stood and walked to the window, pressing his palm against the cool glass. In the distance, barely visible through the rain, he could make out the lights of Cedar Ridge. Somewhere in that town, or perhaps in the city beyond, Margaret might still be alive. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. What right did he have to resurrect a past that someone had deliberately hidden away? His phone buzzed on the table, startling him from his reverie. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and guilt twisted in his stomach. He'd been avoiding her calls for days, unable to explain his growing distance, his inability to focus on anything but the mystery consuming him. "Hey," he answered, trying to inject normalcy into his voice. "Jake, I've been worried sick. You haven't returned my calls, and Mrs. Henderson said she saw you talking to that librarian again yesterday." Sarah's voice carried a mixture of concern and frustration that made his chest tighten. "I'm fine, Sarah. Just working through some things." "What things?" "You moved to that cabin to start over, remember? To build something new, not to disappear into whatever obsession has got hold of you." He closed his eyes, knowing she was right, but unable to explain the pull he felt toward Margaret's story. How could he tell her that he'd found something in this abandoned place that felt more real than anything in his own life? That every letter he read made him question what he knew about love, about sacrifice, about the choices people made when everything they cared about hung in the balance. "I found something," he said finally. "In the cabin. Letters, photographs. There was a woman who lived here during the war, and she—" "Jake, stop!" Sarah's voice was sharp now, cutting through his explanation. "Listen to yourself. You're talking about strangers who died decades ago like they're your family. This isn't healthy." The accusation stung because it held truth. He had been thinking about Margaret and Thomas like family, feeling their separation as if it were his own loss. When he read about Margaret's sleepless nights waiting for word from Thomas, Jake felt the echo of every lonely evening he'd spent in his own life. When he traced Thomas's words about finding home in another person's eyes, something deep in his chest ached with recognition. "Maybe I need to know how their story ends," he said quietly. "Maybe I need to understand what real love looks like." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of rain against glass and Sarah's soft breathing on the other end of the line. "Real love," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "is choosing the person in front of you instead of chasing ghosts." The line went dead, leaving Jake alone with the storm and the scattered remnants of someone else's life. He looked down at the letters again, at Margaret's careful script describing sleepless nights and endless waiting. For the first time since finding them, he wondered if some stories were meant to stay buried, if some mysteries were better left unsolved. But even as doubt crept in, his eyes found the photograph tucked beneath the latest letter, Margaret holding a baby, her smile radiant despite the shadows of wartime worry in her eyes. Somewhere, that child had grown up without knowing their father's story, without understanding the depth of love that had created them. Jake reached for his laptop, determination overriding doubt. Some stories demanded to be finished, no matter the cost. His satellite phone buzzed. Sarah's voice crackled through the static. "Jake, I've got news about your Elena Martinez." His heart hammered against his ribs. "Tell me." "She's alive. Elena Martinez, née Rosewood, aged 94, living in assisted care in Portland." "But Jake," Sarah's voice carried a weight that made his stomach drop. "She has advanced Alzheimer's. Her daughter says she has good days and bad days, but mostly she lives in the past now." Jake closed his eyes, processing the bittersweet revelation. Alive, but perhaps too late. "Does she have family?" "A daughter, Catherine Martinez Webb. She's actually a retired history professor. I explained about the letters, and she wants to meet with you immediately. Jake, there's something else. Catherine says her mother used to tell stories about a cabin in the mountains, about a soldier named Thomas. The family always thought they were just confused memories from her condition. The weight of responsibility settled heavier on Jake's shoulders. I'm coming down, today. There's more. Catherine mentioned her mother had a brother, Elena's son from a brief marriage after the war. His name is David Rosewood. He's been searching for information about his father his entire life. His mother could never tell him much, just fragments. Catherine thinks these letters might be the missing pieces he's been looking for. Jake's mind raced. A son. Thomas had a son who never knew his father's story. The letters weren't just love notes. They were a legacy, a family history that had been lost to time and trauma. After ending the call, Jake moved through the cabin with new purpose. Every board he'd replaced, every window he'd restored, had been leading to this moment. The cabin wasn't just a renovation project anymore. It was a vessel carrying precious cargo across decades. He gathered everything, the original letters carefully preserved in acid-free folders, the photographs, the ring box, even the loose floorboard where they'd been hidden. Each item felt sacred now, weighted with the responsibility of reunion. The drive down the mountain felt like descending from one world into another. Behind him, the cabin stood complete, its windows gleaming in the afternoon sun. He'd finished the work Thomas had started, but now a different kind of construction was beginning, the rebuilding of a family's fractured history. Portland's busy streets felt alien after weeks in the wilderness. Jake found himself checking and rechecking the address Catherine had given him. The assisted living facility was a modern building with manicured gardens, sterile and safe but worlds away from the wild beauty of the mountain cabin. Catherine Martinez-Webb was waiting in the lobby, a woman in her 60s with her mother's delicate bone structure and silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her eyes were red-rimmed but alert, and she clutched a manila folder against her chest. Jake opened his leather satchel and carefully withdrew one of Thomas's letters. Catherine's intake of breath was audible as she recognized the handwriting. "My God," she whispered. "Mother used to trace letters in the air when she was agitated. We thought it was just the disease, but what if she was remembering these?" They sat in a quiet corner of the lobby while Jake explained everything: the cabin, the hidden letters, the love story that had survived decades beneath rotting floorboards. Catherine listened with tears streaming down her face, occasionally asking questions or sharing fragments her mother had mentioned over the years. Jake's throat tightened. "Are you sure? I don't want to upset her." "Mr. Morrison, my mother has been waiting 78 years for someone to bring Thomas home. Even if she only understands for a moment, it's a moment she deserves." They walked down sterile corridors that smelled of disinfectant and institutional meals, but Jake barely noticed. In his hands he carried the weight of a love story that had survived war, separation, and the relentless passage of time. At the doorway of Elena's room, Catherine paused. She might not recognize the significance immediately, but sometimes touch memories are stronger than visual ones. The letters, the ring, they might reach places words can't. Jake nodded, understanding the delicate nature of what they were attempting. Inside that room waited the final piece of Thomas and Elena's story, not an ending, but perhaps, finally, a resolution. The rain hammered against the cabin's newly repaired roof as Jake spread the photographs across the kitchen table. Each image told a piece of the story he'd been piecing together for weeks. Thomas and Elena's wedding day, their honeymoon in the mountains, Elena holding a baby that had to be Sarah. But it was the last photograph that made his hands tremble. Thomas stood in military uniform beside a train, his arm around a woman who wasn't Elena. The woman held a toddler with familiar dark eyes, the same eyes Jake had seen in Sarah's photograph. On the back, in Thomas's careful handwriting, "Maria and little Anna, September 1943. Promise kept. The pieces crashed together with devastating clarity. Thomas hadn't abandoned his family, he'd been protecting another one. Jake's phone buzzed. Sarah's voice crackled through the poor connection. "I've been thinking about what you said. about my father having his reasons. My mother used to talk in her sleep sometimes, especially near the end. She'd cry and say, "Maria needs him too." I never understood what she meant. "Sarah, I think," Jake began, but a sharp knock interrupted him. Through the rain-streaked window, he saw a figure hunched under a heavy coat. "Someone's here. Can I call you back?" He opened the door to find an elderly woman, her silver hair plastered to her head despite the hood she wore. Her eyes, dark and intense, swept over him before settling on the photographs visible on the table behind him. "You're the one restoring this place," she said, her accent carrying traces of Spanish beneath decades of American English. "I'm Ana Restrepo. I believe you've found something that belongs to my family." Jake's heart stopped. Ana, the toddler from the photograph, stood before him, now in her 80s but unmistakably the same person. "Please come in. You're soaked." She stepped inside, her gaze moving reverently around the cabin. "It looks just like I remember. My stepfather brought me here once when I was very young, said it was important I see where real love lived." "Stepfather?" Ana smiled, though tears gathered in her eyes. "Thomas Martinez, though he legally adopted me when he married my mother in 1944. She was a war widow, barely surviving with a sick child. He could have had any life he wanted after the war, but he chose us." Jake sank into a chair, the weight of understanding settling over him. He never abandoned Elena. He made an impossible choice. Not abandoned, no, but he did choose. Ana moved to the photographs, touching the image of her younger self with gentle fingers. "My mother told me the story when I was older. Thomas had loved Elena completely, but she was already gone when he met us. He thought she'd died in the London bombings. Her last letter never reached him, and the building where she worked was destroyed." The rain continued its relentless assault as Ana continued. "He was broken when he found us. My mother, Maria, was dying slowly from tuberculosis, and I was sickly, malnourished. He could have walked away, but Thomas didn't know how to abandon people who needed him. But Elena was alive," Jake said quietly. "She came here, waited for him. For years, yes, even after she received word that he'd married someone else." Anna's voice grew heavy with old sorrow. "They never saw each other again, but they never stopped loving each other either. My mother knew. She was grateful to Thomas, loved him in her way, but she knew her heart was only part of his." Jake thought of the letters he'd found, the yearning that bled through Elena's words even decades later. Sarah, Elena's daughter. She's been searching for answers about her father her whole life. Ana nodded. "I know. I've been searching for her too, ever since my stepfather died. He left me this." She pulled a worn envelope from her coat. A letter for Elena's daughter, if she could ever be found. He'd hired investigators over the years, but Elena had covered her tracks well. "There's something else," Ana continued. "Thomas never sold his half of this cabin. According to his will, it belongs to Elena's heirs, to Sarah. He hoped someday she might find her way here, find the truth." Lightning illuminated the cabin, and for a moment Jake could almost see the ghosts of the past. Thomas and Elena's brief happiness, the weight of impossible choices, the ripple effects of love and loss across generations. "I have Sarah's number," he said finally. "She's been waiting her whole life to understand. Maybe it's time she met her sister." Anna's eyes widened. "Sister? Not by blood, but by the man who loved you both enough to carry the weight of an impossible choice." Jake reached for his phone. "Some families aren't made by birth. They're made by the choices people make when love demands sacrifice." The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, healing finally began. The morning light filtered through the cabin's restored windows as Jake spread the translated letters across the kitchen table. Each page revealed another piece of Elena and Thomas's story, and with every word the weight of their separation pressed heavier on his chest. Sarah sat beside him, her fingers tracing the faded ink of Elena's handwriting. Jake's jaw tightened. The urgency he'd felt since finding the letters now burned like a fire in his veins. Somewhere out there, if fate had been kind, Thomas Novak might still be alive, still wondering what had happened to the woman he'd loved enough to risk everything for. "We need to find him," Jake said, standing abruptly. "Today." Sarah looked up at him with concern. "Jake, we don't even know if he's still—" "He's alive." The certainty in his voice surprised even him. "I can feel it. Call it intuition, call it crazy, but he's out there somewhere." Dr. Hernandez arrived an hour later with copies of immigration records and a determined expression. "I've been up half the night," she announced, setting down a thick folder. "But I think I found something." She opened the folder to reveal a ship's manifest dated 1952. Her finger pointed to a name halfway down the page: Thomas Novak, age 28, destination New York. "He made it to America," Jake breathed. "That's not all." Dr. Hernandez pulled out another document. "I cross-referenced his name with naturalization records, military service files, everything I could access. Thomas Novak became Thomas Nash in 1954. He served in the Korean War, came back, and settled in Pennsylvania." Sarah leaned forward. "Pennsylvania? That's only a few hours from here." "There's more." Dr. Hernandez's voice carried a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "I found a Thomas Nash, age 96, living in a care facility in Harrisburg. The birth year matches perfectly." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake felt his heart hammering against his ribs. After 70 years, after decades of wondering and waiting, Thomas might be just a car ride away. "We have to go," Jake said. "Right now." The drive to Harrisburg felt both endless and too short. Jake gripped the steering wheel while Sarah sat in the passenger seat, carefully holding the wooden box containing Elena's letters and the engagement ring. Neither of them spoke much, both lost in the magnitude of what they were about to do. Sunset Manor was a modest assisted living facility surrounded by oak trees. As they walked through the front doors, Jake wondered how many stories these walls had witnessed, how many lives had intersected within these halls. The nurse who greeted them was skeptical at first. "Mr. Nash doesn't get many visitors," she explained. "Are you family?" "We have something that belongs to him," Sarah said gently. "Something he's been waiting for a very long time." The nurse studied their faces, perhaps recognizing the gravity of their mission. "He's in the garden. He spends most afternoons there, reading." They found him on a bench beneath a maple tree, a book resting in his lap. Even at 96, Thomas Nash carried himself with dignity. His hair was white as snow, his hands weathered with age, but his eyes, those same eyes that had looked back at Jake from the photograph, were alert and bright. Jake approached slowly, his throat tight with emotion. "Mr. Nash, Thomas?" The old man looked up, confusion flickering across his features. "Yes? My name is Jake Morrison. This is Sarah Chen. We have something for you, something from Elena." The book slipped from Thomas's hands, hitting the ground with a soft thud. The color drained from his face, and for a moment, Jake feared the shock might be too much. "Elena?" Thomas's voice was barely a whisper. "How do you? She's been gone for 70 years. Sarah knelt beside the bench and opened the wooden box. "She left these for you, in a cabin in the mountains. She never stopped believing you would find each other again." Jake watched as 70 years of questions began to find their answers. Thomas's fingers trembled as he traced the words his beloved had written, words meant for him alone. "She waited," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "She waited for me. She never stopped loving you," Sarah said softly. "And she made sure her love would find you, even after all this time." As Thomas clutched the letters to his chest, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, Jake understood that some promises transcend death itself. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin's porch as Jake finished loading the last of his tools into the truck bed. 3 months ago, he'd arrived here seeking solitude, planning nothing more than a simple renovation. Now he was leaving with a heart full of purpose and a mission that felt larger than anything he'd ever undertaken. Sarah emerged from the cabin carrying a carefully wrapped bundle, the original letters and photographs they'd discovered beneath the floorboards. Her fingers traced the edges of the package with reverence, as if she held something sacred. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, though Jake could see in her eyes that she already knew his answer. "I've never been more sure of anything." He closed the tailgate and turned to face her. Elena Kowalski deserves to know the truth about her father, and somewhere out there, Mikhail's family might still be searching for answers too. The drive to Portland felt both endless and too short. They'd spent the previous evening planning their approach, researching what little they could find about Elena online. She lived in a modest apartment near Powell Butte, had worked as a seamstress for 40 years before retiring, and had never married. The newspaper article about her search for information had been their only lead. Published just 6 months ago in a community newsletter, Sarah reached over and placed her hand on his arm. "Whatever happens, we're doing the right thing." The apartment building was a simple 2-story structure with faded blue siding and well-tended flower boxes beneath each window. They climbed the stairs to apartment 2B, and Jake found himself hesitating before knocking. Once they crossed this threshold, there would be no going back. The woman who answered the door was small and elegant, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and eyes the same startling blue as the man in the photographs. Elena Kowalski was unmistakably her father's daughter. "Miss Kowalski," Sarah stepped forward. "My name is Sarah Chen, and this is Jake Morrison. We read your article in the newsletter about searching for information about your father." Elena's hand fluttered to her throat. "You have news about my papa? May we come in? What we have to share. It's quite a story." Elena's living room was filled with handmade quilts and old photographs, a lifetime of carefully preserved memories. She served them tea in delicate china cups, her movements precise, despite the tremor Jake noticed in her hands. "I was only 4 when Papa left," she began, settling into her armchair. "Mama always said he went to find work, that he would send for us, but the letters stopped coming. And then," she shrugged, a gesture that spoke of decades of unanswered questions. Jake exchanged a glance with Sarah, then carefully unwrapped the bundle they'd brought. He placed the first photograph on the coffee table, Mikhail in his army uniform, smiling with youthful confidence. Elena's teacup clattered against its saucer. "Papa," she whispered, reaching for the photograph with shaking fingers. "This is my papa. Where did you find this?" "In a cabin up in the Cascade Mountains," Jake said gently. "Your father stayed there for several weeks in 1953. He left behind letters, photographs, and a journal. Elena, your father didn't abandon you. He was trying to get back to you and your mother." As they shared Mikhail's story, his injury, his recuperation in the cabin, his love for his family, and ultimately his death in the avalanche, Elena wept quietly. But Jake could see something else in her expression, relief. The terrible uncertainty that had haunted her for 70 years was finally lifting. "He wrote about us?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Sarah opened the journal to a passage they'd marked, "Every day." "Listen to this. Elena grows more beautiful each day. She has her mother's grace, but my stubborn streak. I pray she will forgive me for being away so long." Elena covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with tears, but also with something that might have been joy. "All these years I thought he didn't love us enough to stay. Mama died believing he had started a new family somewhere else. He loved you more than his own life," Jake said. "Every page of his journal proves that." They spent the next 2 hours sharing everything they'd discovered. Elena listened with rapt attention, asking questions, studying each photograph as if trying to memorize every detail. When they finally prepared to leave, she insisted they take something back with them. "This was his," she said, pressing a small wooden cross into Jake's hands. "Mama kept it hoping he would return for it someday." As they drove away, Jake felt the weight of the cross in his pocket and knew their journey was only beginning. The courthouse steps felt cold beneath Jake's boots as he waited for Margaret to emerge from the building. 3 hours had passed since she'd gone inside with the adoption records and DNA test results. 3 hours of him pacing between the courthouse and the small cafe across the street, unable to sit still or focus on anything but the magnitude of what they might discover. When the heavy oak doors finally swung open, Margaret appeared looking older than her 78 years, clutching a manila envelope against her chest. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but there was something else there too, a spark of hope Jake hadn't seen before. "She's alive," Margaret whispered, her voice carrying across the afternoon air. "My daughter is alive." Jake's heart hammered as he approached her, Elena close behind. They'd driven down from the mountain together that morning, the three of them bound by the strange threads of fate that had woven their lives together through Thomas and Catherine's love story. "Her name is Sarah Chen now," Margaret continued, her hands trembling as she opened the envelope. "Sarah Chen Peterson. She was adopted by a family in Portland when she was 6 months old. The DNA results confirm it. She's Catherine's daughter. She's my granddaughter." Elena reached out to steady Margaret as the older woman swayed slightly. "Does it say where she is now?" "Portland still. She's a pediatric nurse at Oregon Health and Science University Hospital. She's 57 years old, Jake. I've missed 57 years of her life." Margaret's voice broke on the last words, decades of grief and guilt spilling over. Jake studied the documents Margaret handed him. The adoption records painted a stark picture of post-war chaos. Catherine Chen, unmarried mother, Chinese immigrant surrendering her infant daughter to the state. The shame and desperation she must have felt twisted something deep in Jake's chest. "There's more," Margaret said quietly. She pulled out a newer document, official letterhead from a private investigation firm. "I hired someone to find her after we discovered the letters. This came yesterday." "She never gave up," Elena breathed, reading over Jake's shoulder. "All these years, she never stopped hoping." Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "The investigator says she's requested her adoption file dozens of times over the years. She knows her birth mother's name was Catherine Chen, but the records were sealed. She doesn't know about Thomas, doesn't know about me, doesn't know her mother's story." Jake felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. The cabin renovation that had started as a simple escape from his own pain had become something far more significant. He was holding the key to healing wounds that had festered for more than 5 decades. "We have to tell her," he said firmly. "She deserves to know about her parents, about their love story, about you." "What if she doesn't want to see me?" Margaret's voice was small, vulnerable. "What if she blames me for keeping them apart? I cost her the chance to know her father. I cost Catherine everything." Elena took Margaret's hands in hers. "From what we've learned about Catherine, she wouldn't want you carrying this guilt. She loved Thomas enough to let him go when she thought it was best for everyone. Love isn't always about holding on. Sometimes it's about forgiveness." Jake thought about his own parents, about the conversations they'd never had before they died in that car accident, about all the words left unsaid and the chances that vanished when you waited too long to take them. "The investigator included her contact information," he said, pointing to the bottom of the report. "She works the day shift at the hospital. We could drive down to Portland tomorrow." "We'll call first," Jake assured her. "Explain who we are, what we've found. Give her the choice." The three of them stood on the courthouse steps as the afternoon shadows lengthened, each lost in their own thoughts about the magnitude of the moment. Jake thought about the careful way he'd preserved every letter, every photograph, every trace of Thomas and Catherine's love story. He'd unknowingly been preparing for this reunion all along. "There's something else you should know," Margaret said finally. "The investigator found out she has children. Twin daughters. They're 25 years old." Jake felt his breath catch. Thomas Chen's bloodline hadn't ended in that cabin after all. Somewhere in Portland, 2 young women were living their lives, completely unaware that their great-grandfather had been a war hero whose love story had survived decades of separation. "Then we're not just reuniting a mother and daughter," Elena said softly. "We're reuniting generations." The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window as Marcus sat at the worn wooden table. Eleanor's journal spread before him like a roadmap to the past. His coffee had grown cold hours ago, but he couldn't tear himself away from her words. Each entry revealed another layer of the love story that had unfolded within these walls, and with each page, the weight of responsibility pressed heavier on his shoulders. Sarah emerged from the bedroom, her hair tousled from sleep, wearing one of his flannel shirts that hung loose on her frame. She moved with the quiet grace he'd come to cherish, padding barefoot across the floor to pour herself coffee from the pot he'd made at dawn. "You've been up all night again," she said, settling beside him. Her fingers traced the edge of the journal's yellowed pages. "What did you find?" Marcus rubbed his eyes, feeling the grit of exhaustion. The rest of the story, why Eleanor never left the cabin, even after the war ended. He turned several pages, revealing Eleanor's increasingly desperate handwriting. She kept believing Thomas would come back. "But there's more." Sarah leaned closer, her warmth a comfort against his side. "Tell me." She was pregnant when he left. Marcus's voice carried the weight of discovery. She had his child here, alone. A daughter named Rose. He pointed to an entry dated 6 months after Thomas's departure. "Listen to this. Rose has his eyes, that deep brown that reminds me of rich earth. She reaches for the sunlight streaming through the window, and I pretend it's his hand she's grasping for." Sarah's breath caught. What happened to her? To Rose? Marcus turned more pages, his movements careful with the fragile paper. Eleanor raised her here for 3 years, but then he paused at an entry that had made his chest tight when he'd first read it. "The fever took hold yesterday. Dr. Henley says there's nothing more to be done. My sweet Rose, my piece of Thomas, slips further away with each breath." The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. Sarah's hand found his, squeezing tight. "Oh, Marcus!" She buried Rose behind the cabin, under the oak tree. He gestured toward the back window. That's why she stayed. She couldn't leave her daughter, and she couldn't stop hoping Thomas would return to find them both. His finger traced Eleanor's words. "I tend Rose's grave each morning and watch the road each evening. One day love will bring him home to us." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, but he never came. No, the last entry is dated 1952. Eleanor was 73. Marcus turned to the final page where the handwriting had become shaky and faint. "If someone finds these words, know that love lived here. Know that some promises transcend time itself. In the trunk beneath the floorboards you'll find what matters most. Please, let them know we waited." Marcus stood and walked to the loose floorboard they'd discovered weeks ago. He'd already removed the trunk Eleanor mentioned, but now her words gave new meaning to its contents. The small wooden chest sat on the counter where he'd placed it the night before, still unopened. "She wanted someone to find this," he said, lifting the trunk's lid with reverent care. Inside, wrapped in faded blue silk, lay a collection of letters tied with ribbon, a silver locket, and a small wooden toy, a horse carved with intricate detail. Sarah joined him, her fingers hovering over the items. "These are Thomas's letters to her. And this," Marcus lifted the toy horse, "was for Rose. Look at the craftsmanship. He made this during the war, probably carried it through every battle, planning to give it to the daughter he never knew existed." The locket contained a tiny photograph, a young woman holding a small child, both smiling at the camera. Eleanor and Rose preserved in silver and time. On the back, an inscription, "For Thomas, with all our love, come home to us." Marcus felt Sarah's tears against his shoulder as she leaned into him. They never knew about each other. Thomas never knew he had a daughter, and Rose never knew her father. "But we know," Marcus said, closing the locket carefully, "and maybe that's enough. Maybe that's why we found this place." He turned to face her, seeing his own determination reflected in her eyes. "Eleanor asked us to let them know. Thomas's family, they deserve to know what happened here. They deserve to know about Rose, about how Eleanor kept their love alive." Sarah nodded, understanding flooding her features. "We have to find them. We have to try." Marcus gathered the letters, the weight of decades-old hope heavy in his hands. Whatever's left of Thomas's family, wherever they are, They need to know this story. They need to know that love like this existed, that it survived everything the world threw at it. Outside, the wind stirred the branches of the oak tree, where a small grave lay marked only by Eleanor's memory and the changing seasons. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin's restored porch as Marcus secured the last piece of weather stripping around the front door. 3 days had passed since Elena's call, and each hour felt like a countdown he couldn't escape. The renovation was nearly complete, every board lovingly restored to honor the story it held, but his heart remained in turmoil. He stepped back to admire his work, running calloused fingers along the smooth pine railing he'd rebuilt using Samuel's original design. The cabin looked exactly as it had in the faded photographs he'd found tucked beneath the floorboards, a testament to enduring love that had waited 73 years to be discovered. The car stopped, and Marcus watched as an elderly woman emerged from the passenger side. Even at 89, Elena Kowalski moved with surprising grace, her silver hair catching the morning light. Behind the wheel sat a man Marcus assumed was her son, David, who'd insisted on making the drive from Denver despite Elena's protests that she could manage alone. "Oh my God," Elena whispered, her hand pressed to her chest as she stared at the cabin. "It's exactly as I remember." Marcus approached slowly, giving her space to process the flood of memories that must be washing over her. He'd rehearsed this moment countless times, but now that it was here, words seemed inadequate. "Mrs. Kowalski," he said softly. "I'm Marcus. We spoke on the phone." Elena turned to him with eyes that sparkled with unshed tears. "You've done something miraculous here, young man. Samuel would be—" She paused, composing herself. "He would be so grateful." "It almost wasn't," Marcus admitted. "When I found it, the roof had collapsed, and most people would have torn it down. But once I discovered what was hidden inside—" Elena's breath caught. "You found them? The letters?" Marcus nodded, pulling a carefully wrapped bundle from his jacket pocket. "All of them, including the ones Samuel never had the chance to send." With trembling hands, Elena accepted the letters. She held them against her heart for a long moment before looking up at Marcus. "Would it be all right if I—" "Of course," Marcus said quickly. "This is your place now. Take all the time you need." Elena walked toward the cabin with reverent steps, her fingers trailing along the porch railing. "He built this with his own hands," she murmured to David. "Every board, every nail. He said it would be our sanctuary." Marcus watched from a respectful distance as Elena entered the cabin. Through the windows he could see her moving from room to room, touching surfaces, remembering. When she reached the spot where the floorboards had hidden their secrets, she knelt carefully and placed her palm flat against the wood. "She's never gotten over him," David said quietly, joining Marcus. "Dad was a good man, and she loved him, but she always carried a piece of her heart that belonged to someone else. When you called," he shook his head, "I haven't seen her this alive in years." "There's something else," Marcus said gently. "Something I didn't mention on the phone because I needed to be sure." He pulled out his smartphone and showed her the photograph he'd taken of Samuel's final letter. He had a son, born 8 months after he left for Korea. Elena's legs nearly gave out, and David caught her arm. "A son?" "James Samuel Kowalski. Samuel never knew about him." Marcus paused, gathering courage for what came next. "Elena, I found him. He's alive, living in Seattle with his family, your family." The letters slipped from Elena's fingers, scattering across the porch. "That's impossible. I would have known. Someone would have told me." "Samuel's mother gave the baby up for adoption before she died. She thought you'd moved on, started a new life. But I tracked down the records, hired an investigator." Marcus knelt to gather the fallen letters. "James has been looking for his father his entire life. When I told him about Samuel, about you, Elena, he wants to meet you." Elena sank into the porch chair Marcus had built, her face a canvas of emotions, shock, joy, grief, and hope all warring for dominance. "Samuel's son," she whispered. "All these years." David was already reaching for his phone. "What's his number?" As Marcus watched Elena clutch Samuel's letters to her chest, while her son prepared to call the family she'd never known existed, he felt something shift inside him. This cabin had taught him that love wasn't just about finding someone, it was about the courage to let that love transform you, even when the risk seemed insurmountable. The morning sun filtered through the cabin's restored windows as Jake stood on the porch, watching two figures emerge from the tree line. Margaret Chen walked slowly but steadily, her arm linked with that of a tall, silver-haired man, whose eyes held the same gentle strength Jake had seen in the photographs, hidden beneath the floorboards. Thomas Hartwell had aged gracefully, his face lined with years of quiet dignity and unspoken longing. When his gaze fell upon the cabin, their cabin, his steps faltered, and Margaret's grip on his arm tightened. "It's exactly as I remembered," Thomas whispered, his voice carrying across the clearing. Jake descended the porch steps, his heart hammering against his ribs. 3 months ago he'd been a man running from his own ghosts, seeking solitude in these mountains. Now he stood as witness to a love story that had waited 73 years for its final chapter. Margaret's daughter, Susan, emerged from behind them, tears already streaming down her cheeks. She had been the bridge between past and present, the one who had helped Jake track down Thomas through veterans organizations and nursing home records. The search had led them to a small town in Oregon, where Thomas had lived quietly, never marrying, never quite able to let go of the woman he'd left behind. "Margaret," Thomas breathed as she approached, and the decades collapsed between them like morning mist. She released Susan's arm and took those final steps alone, her weathered hands reaching up to touch his face. "You came back," she said, her voice breaking on the words they'd both waited a lifetime to hear. "I never stopped trying to find you," he replied, covering her hands with his own. "When the war ended, I came back to the cabin, but you were gone. Your family had moved, left no forwarding address. I searched for years." Jake felt like an intruder on this sacred moment, but Margaret turned to him, her eyes bright with tears and gratitude. "Thank you," she said simply, "for bringing us home." The reunion unfolded like a dream made manifest. They walked through the cabin together, Thomas marveling at Jake's restoration work, recognizing details that had lived only in his memory for decades. Margaret showed him where Jake had found their letters, their photographs, the small treasures of their interrupted courtship. In the bedroom where Jake had discovered the loose floorboard, Thomas knelt and ran his fingers over the restored wood. "I hid a ring here," he said quietly, "the night before I shipped out. I was going to give it to you when I came back." Jake's throat tightened as he retrieved the small velvet box from his jacket pocket. He'd found it weeks ago, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked deeper in the hiding place than the other items. "Is this what you're looking for?" Thomas's hands shook as he accepted the box, opening it to reveal a simple gold band with a modest diamond that caught the afternoon light. After all these years, it still gleamed with promise and hope. "Margaret Chen," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the tears on his cheeks. "I know we're not the young people we once were, but my heart hasn't changed. Will you marry me?" Her answer came not in words, but in the way she extended her left hand, fingers trembling with joy and anticipation. As Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger, Jake felt something shift inside his own chest, a loosening of the tight knots of cynicism and fear that had driven him to these mountains. The celebration that followed was simple but profound. Susan had brought champagne and a photographer to document this extraordinary day. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jake found himself sitting on the porch steps, watching 3 generations of a family reunited by love's persistence. Margaret and Thomas sat together on the porch swing Jake had built, their fingers intertwined, speaking in the hushed tones of people sharing 7 decades of separate stories. Susan sat nearby, recording everything with her phone, determined that this chapter of their family's history would never be lost again. "Jake," Margaret called softly, "come sit with us." He joined them reluctantly, still feeling like an outsider to their miracle. But Thomas fixed him with a steady gaze. "You've given us back our lives," the old man said. "More than that, you've shown us that some things are worth waiting for, worth fighting for, no matter how impossible they seem." They were all different people than they'd been that morning, transformed by the simple act of refusing to let love surrender to time.